So this is a little bit of a departure from what we normally do, but we're talking straight pop culture right now. But of course, it's 2 months later than when it was really a hot topic. But now that it's out on Netflix, we got a chance to watch it, and it was something that we were watching when we would come home from the walks the past week,
Yes.
and that is the Michael Jordan documentary, The Last Dance. And it felt like there was some tie-ins related to what we were doing with this project, so we thought we would discuss it.
Yeah, so like Mike said, we've been watching it just recently. I know a lot of people watched it when it first came out. I don't remember what platform it came out on.
ESPN
ESPN.
and ABC by extension.
Oh, and ABC by extension. But we don't have either of those platforms.
Well, we have ABC, but
Oh.
it would have been very difficult. It was like they were playing it on Sundays.
Oh, it was coming out like in real time on the TV.
It was coming out on ESPN one day, and then it was coming out on ABC another day. I saw chunks, 2-minute chunks, but we would have had to really structure our life in order to see this.
Okay. So I guess we should get into talking about what the show was about because now
Rather than the time.
rather than telling me how it was released.
And now, your TV schedule from 3 months ago.
So anyway, yeah, we were watching The Last Dance. We just finished it. For any of you who don't know, which is probably not many of you, but The Last Dance is the docuseries about the Bulls, the basketball team that Michael Jordan played on, and Scottie Pippen played on, and Dennis Rodman played on, among other young men in the early 90s and late 90s. And in 1998 was their season, which they coined The Last Dance.
Yes. The documentary is primarily about Michael Jordan, starting with his college years and the childhood and whatnot. And the footage that they acquired during the 98 season, the last season of Michael Jordan, was pretty in-depth, behind the scenes. They got remarkable access. And so the narrative arc of the series is following the entirety of the 98 season and then going back in time, depending on the specifics of a given episode, to cover the career of Jordan or the key pieces that were a part of the Bulls dynasty.
Right.
So, yeah. Do you want to continue about what your thoughts were?
Yeah, well, I had a lot of thoughts. So, as far as, well, you just mentioned that the way that the documentary was made was that you follow along the 1998 season and then it goes back in time. I was so confused. They kept going back in time to games and then they would jump forward and they were introducing players that had played in 1993, for example, but then they didn't play in 98 and then they'd end one game, but then they'd jump to another game. And you had no problem with this.
No.
I don't know if it had anything to do with the fact that maybe you knew
I'm sure that helped.
more about who was who. There were some days I was also trying to do computer work while watching it, so that probably didn't help me.
Mm-hmm.
But even when I was just fully watching it, I was getting so confused. That might have been a me problem. That might have been a docuseries problem. I don't know. I'm curious if anyone else has seen it and had the same issue. And if not, that's fine. It might just be me. But I also thought that the way that Michael Jordan is competitive was fascinating. And I'm sure that's probably a takeaway for a lot of people. But I kept finding it conflicting for myself because I admire so much what an amazing athlete he was. And I guess maybe still is. Maybe he's still alive. I don't know what kind of basketball he's playing these days. But yeah, when his career was really happening, he had this ability to compete and to make his moves like superhuman. And I admire that. I think that's really amazing. But the documentary talked a lot about sort of the inner workings of his mind and how he made that happen. And that I really I really had a hard time with it. It was a lot of picking one team or one person that he was going to have beef with and that he needed to show up in order to prove himself and prove that he was better, which I guess is what competition is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, in that arena, it is useful, but it's not really what I'm trying to do in my life. So I think that's why I had a hard time hearing that that's how it happens. I think I wanted it to be just more, oh, I have this innate ability for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, yeah, like I said, I feel conflicted about it. I admire it, but I'm also, it made me upset to see that this person who we think of as this hero was kind of mean to people and motivated himself by being sort of angry with other people and having these feuds.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't seem like he also seems like a nice enough guy, and it doesn't seem like he did anything in his personal life that was mean or bad. So
Well,
I guess it's fine. It didn't carry off the court, really, as far as I could tell or as far as I know.
yeah. Well,
But
he's an ultimate. He's just a fascinating character,
yeah.
and not entirely. I don't think entirely a good character.
Mm.
He has world-class compartmentalization skills that
Yeah.
are maybe exceeding his talents as an athlete.
Yeah, compartmentalization is what it is, I guess, huh? I don't really have much of that. So I was gonna say it's like he's living as a double agent, which I guess is what that would be, is like having sort of multiple areas where you hold different thoughts and experiences.
Yeah. There are so many things to say about this, which is why we're doing a separate thing that's unrelated to our podcast. But several moments that stick out when they talk about his gambling issue. For those, it's hard to. I think we're just going to talk about it as though everybody watched it. I don't think that explaining everything about Michael Jordan's life makes sense.
Yeah.
When they talk about the gambling issue, and he does an interview where he says he doesn't have a gambling problem, he has a competition problem. There is something that's really intense about our society that like we need to get to the bottom of, where he says he has a problem, but it's not construed as a problem. Like that, if he has a competition problem, and then we're all enablers. We are making it so that he cannot get over that problem. We are having him perform for us because we want to see quote unquote greatness.
Right.
But we are ruining a man, and as an extension, really compromising our society by raising up that behavior as the behavior that is quote unquote greatness.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, he did have a competition problem. You see how he interacts with everybody. You see him gambling with his bodyguards over flicking coins. You see the fact that he had, $1 million plus gambling debt. I believe it's what it might have been 140,000, but I think it was like 1.4 million with that one guy.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's
I mean,
not.
he had the money to pay it.
But that's not what it. It
But
doesn't
that's
matter.
not what it.
It's not what it's about. He does have a competition problem.
Right.
The idea that like he has to keep doubling down in order to like, make that happen.
Yeah.
And
Well, there were interviews even of other players saying they would play cards the night before the game, and it was if you were ahead against Michael Jordan, he wouldn't stop playing until he was ahead. And then even then, they said he wouldn't stop playing until he was ahead by a lot.
Yeah.
Like he had to not only win, but he had to win by an embarrassing amount.
Yeah.
And you saw that in the games too, in the basketball games. That was what made him amazing, is that they could be behind and then he would just go out there and win because he had to win.
Yeah.
And then he would force his body to make it happen in whatever way it needed to happen. And of course, he had an amazing basketball skill as well. You can't just will yourself to win pro basketball games over and over. But it was a mental thing where he was able to force himself to push through whatever barrier was in front of him to win.
Mm-hmm. There is something that's going on in the documentary, and I mean, it's not like the documentary invented this. This is part of it in society. It's just kind of coalesced it all. The narrative that was going on here was this idea of what is greatness and what cost it is in order to achieve greatness, and felt very similar to the idea of artist greatness, which is something that is a little more well-worn, where it's like the suffering artist or the lengths to which somebody's life might be compromised in order to achieve a singular vision. And that's not something that necessarily gets played up as much in athletics, I think, but it's definitely something that got played up in this documentary. And maybe they went that angle in order to elevate the idea of greatness.
Right.
But it's not any more healthy in arts. It's not something that we should really be celebrating as a culture. I think it is so alluring to a human brain biologically because the singularity of vision is so pure. It allows us to feel relief from the daily gray areas that we have to deal with all the time, to just be able to see somebody and go, yes, that is the greatest. I don't have to think so much about what is correct, because here is an example of correctness for me to unburden my mind, you know? And that's just not what life is, and it creates all sorts of problems because this also was a person who was a tremendous businessman and not in a great way either. You know, he was also this idea that like he was not a bad person off the court that you mentioned is because his compartmentalization skills were so strong that he could just maintain this facade of who he was in order to promote Gatorade and Nike and Hanes and all of these things. And they talk about in the documentary when Nike signed him, they were an upstart. They expected in 4 years to make like $4 million on shoes, I think was the idea.
Right.
And in the first year, they made $126 million. There is no way that you can do something like that without cutting corners, without sacrificing human, not direct lives, but without creating human suffering.
Yeah.
You just can't ramp up that fast without there something unethical happening.
Well, and now we know
Right.
that, Nike does use human lives in a really bad way to make their shoes.
Yeah.
And they did then and they do now.
Yeah. And Michael Jordan's perspective on the whole thing was to remain apolitical. They talk about that during the broadcast or during the series. And that's one of those things where you always want to say it is not just necessary for anybody to be political all the time, or it is the prerogative of that person to, have a certain stake in things. And that is true to a degree, but that means it is all the more important for the public to be ever vigilant in these sorts of things and to question why and how all of these things are being created. we can't just let there be this, like, there's now a shoe culture as a consequence of this thing, and that's built on human suffering.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and that directly links into what we're doing with the walking, right? Because
Right.
I have one pair of Nikes that I've been wearing that are not made in China, but I realized over the last couple weeks that Nike still does a lot of work in China and does a lot of work with the Uyghur population in China, which is not breaking news. It's been going on for a long time, but it's sort of coming up in our zeitgeist again. That's being done in a way that's really, really, really inhumane. And so I'm not going to buy any more Nikes. I will use those shoes until they fall apart because I'm not going to waste it, but I'm definitely not going to support that company anymore. But they're big enough that they don't need my support. And even if people boycott, at this point, they've grown. All of these shoe companies have grown to a point where even if a bunch of people boycott, it's not going to matter. It's not going to hurt their bottom line. There needs to be some sort of massive thought pattern shift to force them to actually care about the people that are making their products.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, the shoe culture has definitely become a thing based on those endorsements that many different athletes got. But I think Michael Jordan sort of started that trend.
And it's
a lot to put on. Like, I also don't want to put all of this on him because he's one individual, and a lot of things get started and he's not clairvoyant. He is an amazing basketball player and he's super competitive and he's able to train his mind to work in certain ways, but he's not clairvoyant. He doesn't know what the future holds. No one could know, oh, I'm going to sign this contract and then in 20 years, people in internment camps in China are going to be making these shoes.
It hasn't been 20 years. It's been longer. It has been, well, that's not what I meant to say, but it has been longer.
Mm-hmm.
But also, he's not, I can't imagine he hasn't heard that this is a thing that was happening. And he's chosen not to,
Right,
not
and he
to
hasn't
say.
spoken about it since then.
He is one person. But if you're going to list the people that have had the greatest cultural impact since we've been alive, he might be, he's definitely top 5.
Yeah.
And that's, he has that compartmentalization thing. And I don't know. He's a deeply flawed person. This is what the documentary revealed, but not in the way that the documentary, I think, intended to do.
Right.
It was it's the lionization of ultra competitiveness and the singular vision, again, which makes people feel at ease and, feels like they're seeing something special. While they were alive, they saw something special. But you're not seeing, you're seeing a deeply hurt human being. There's a couple things that I think about. One, when you look at the 4th championship, so they had 2 3-peats. The 4th championship was after the death of his father.
Mm-hmm.
And you see him crying on the floor of the locker room after he wins by himself. And the level of emotional release, this is roughly 18 months, maybe a little longer after his father died. There is something poetic about it, something that definitely makes you feel empathetic towards him about it. But watching it too, in a way that I would not expect, it feels like it's 1 or 2 steps away from a Christopher Guest movie. And I don't mean to make fun of Michael Jordan, but that level of compartmentalization is so unhealthy that it's almost parody. That.
Yeah, it's really, and it's really sad. It's like you said, you do empathize with him, certainly, and on one hand, I'm glad that he had that emotional release because clearly he needed it. But it's like you said, yeah, for it to be 18 months later. And it's almost like he had to keep it inside in a separate space in order to play the way he did.
But we're using, these are the examples. I mean, grew up with him. Be like Mike. I mean, it's the phrase of the freaking commercial.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these are the examples that we're using in order to decide what greatness is in our society.
Right.
Compress all your feelings. Make it about anger towards somebody, or
Right.
make it about suppression of somebody so that it can fuel you, so that you can have this moment that ultimately is meaningless. Like,
Yeah.
it's tremendously meaningful to him because he has put so much meaning into it,
Right.
but winning an NBA championship does not do anything for anyone, even
No.
for him. It really
No.
just fuels him to, okay, I got to do it again. And now
Right.
I got to do it again. There is no ends to this means.
Right.
And it, I don't think it's coincidental that his period of playing time coincides with the second term of Ronald Reagan and the two terms of, like Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
Like, those are areas in time where it was very much self-centered drive, top-down thought process. And even the Clinton era, where it's like supposedly the Democrats, the socially, conscious people took back control, they were neoliberals. They were
Mm-hmm.
using big companies in order to fuel growth. There was not a lot of socially conscious thought going on. There were labeling of super predators and the industrial complex,
Mm-hmm.
prison complex,
Mm-hmm.
things that we're really only seeing in, the rear view now. But these are all the types of things that were about singular effort and me culture and consumerism. And he was their star for that.
Yeah.
Certainly, there was no direct political connections. I mean, he was very apolitical, which
Right.
was highlighted in the movie. But it validates that greatness, validates that culture that existed for all that time, that leads to this greater social neglect. You know?
Yeah, and we are really picking up the pieces now and still reeling from it. We see how everyone is super selfish and wanting everything about themselves, right? And we're sort of trying to, as a culture, I think, break that down, or some of us are, but that's so in us. And yeah, I agree with you. I think that period of time didn't really help us culturally.
Yeah. And I understand that there's a whole area of being a role model for Black people that, like, I don't have access to,
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that there are people that looked up to him and have motivated them.
Yeah.
And it's just, for me, it's like, where is this motivation point coming from? What are you learning, particularly from the way now that we get the curtain pulled back, and it's like, he picked people to hate and it fueled him. He made sure that he had one idea for what he wanted to achieve, and he was a taskmaster to everybody, and he didn't let anybody in except for these moments immediately following a championship, at which point he was just emotionally completely open.
Yeah.
These are not healthy traits. These are things that, and also, like, there is so much that went into him succeeding that didn't involve him. The fact that Scottie Pippen was horrifically underpaid for all that time,
Right.
the Phil Jackson angle, the fact that this coach was able to corral all these things, that he had Dennis Rodman there that was this tremendous talent, that there were players that were making winning shots that weren't him either. It's not like he
Mm-hmm.
was doing everything by himself exclusively. There are so, and I mean, to his credit, it's not like he always says the right things about that sort of stuff. Like,
Sure. I
that
think he
is a team effort.
recognizes all of those things.
But then he also turned, like, in other conversations, he turns it on because he knows he's the greatest too. Or it's, that, and there are just so many things that could have gone any other way in any of these situations where this story doesn't exist.
Right.
I remember when I was younger thinking, like, I was very much a win at all cost person and was
Mm.
very upset when I didn't win. And I distinctly remember at a certain point, I don't remember what age, recognizing that that was not healthy
Yeah.
and futile, and learned to turn that off.
Yeah.
I mean, I still definitely have access to the anger as motivation thing, which I don't think is particularly healthy either, but sometimes access it in order to get through like particularly challenging tasks.
Right.
But again, I recognize that that is not necessarily the way you want to live your life.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. As you know, Mike, I'm very anti-competition. Although that's, I mean, on a personal level, I'm pro competition when we're talking about like markets and stuff. I realize that that's a anti-competition isn't really where you want to be if we're talking about like Amazon or something. Compete with Amazon, please, everyone. But no, on a personal level, I really try to stay away from the competition thing too, because I also feel like I've leaned into that in the past and it doesn't do me well. And even in sports, I mentioned in our podcast episode that I ran track. I also meant when you were talking about yards, I said I ran track, I know yards. That is wrong. I ran track, I know meters. Meters are similar to yards, so I can estimate yards. But but I was thinking a lot this week while we've been watching the show about my experience being an athlete. And of course, I was only a high school athlete, but I was on the varsity track team and I did well and I won races and I was competitive, but in a way that it was always against myself. It was always about growth. And when other people would win, I was still able to be happy for them. And I feel like that was great to learn how to balance all of that. That I was able to then carry over into the rest of my life too, and in my work and in the things that I do day to day and in the walk that we're doing. I'm not thinking, and I mean, sometimes I do think, oh, those people are doing this, we should try and be more like them. Or I see other successful people doing endurance feats, and I think, oh man, why are they able to do it and I'm not? Those thoughts do creep in, but I try to just focus on what are we doing? How can we do the best at what we're doing? And what am I going to do to make that happen?
Right.
And I do think that yeah, I mean, I really try to push those other thoughts away because they're toxic. They really cause a lot of pain, like inner emotional pain, to start comparing yourself to other people. And yeah, it's a losing battle for most of us. I think maybe that's the thing. For Michael Jordan, it wasn't a losing battle. When he starts comparing himself to other people, he has the physical strengths and the athleticism to always win.
Well, he didn't win for the first 6 years of his career.
Good point.
It
He
took,
had the team. He had all of those other elements that you were talking about to win when he put himself in those positions. But for most people, you're setting yourself up for failure if you're going into something full of anger and competition and trying to win against everyone and trying to compare yourself to everyone that's around you. You're setting yourself up for failure. And now, especially that we have access to the internet and social media, and you're always going to be comparing yourself to someone that's above you, right?
depends.
And a lot of the times you're going to lose. If you're trying to compare yourself to some famous person by any metric, financial, beauty, fans, whatever it may be, it's just like it's not a fair comparison and you don't even know what their life is really like.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Jordan would be the example of somebody that is maybe not going to lose in a comparison when it comes specifically to basketball. But I think he's a person that trained himself to not have satisfaction.
Yeah.
And that's not greatness, I don't think. I think that's something that should be considered an artifact of a different time. Just like we can marvel at the pyramids, we can recognize that they were made by slaves. And
Mm.
that's not something that we have to build anymore. We should make sure that if we're uplifting people as examples of greatness, we try and find people that are at least making an effort to demonstrate awareness that the things that they're in pursuit of greatness for do not make up the entirety of experience.
Mm.
Experience for themselves and experience for all of humanity. Because when we do dump all of our energy into this one rocketing forward idea, there's all this collateral damage that happens. And that's what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah. I think, I mean, it comes down to metrics of success, right? Like you said, um, you said that you can't share the experience of young Black people looking up to Michael Jordan, of course. And I think a lot of looking up to Michael Jordan has to do with the metrics of success that we're looking up to him for. He's become, I mean, look at any of his sports statistics, and he's up at the highest point in how he performed, right? But there's not really a good way to measure happiness or satisfaction or feelings of fullness or sort of all the other things that we think, oh, if we're successful in these really measurable metrics, then that equals a full, happy life. I think we're learning as a society and as people talk about it that are sort of successful, in quotes, we're learning that that does not equal happiness. But I think that's kind of new for us to know as the regular citizens.
Yeah.
I was going to call us the plebes, but I think that's the the bourgeois would never have told the rest of the people that they weren't happy, but they probably weren't happy.
Right.
And we're just kind of learning now that all these people that have all these other successes, that's not what builds a happy person. There's all sorts of other things that are needed, and a lot of it has to do with taking care of our mind and our relationships and the way that we store our emotions and
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, the pursuit of happiness is everybody's individual business. So there's only so far that we can criticize what Michael Jordan, or even understand what Michael Jordan's happiness level is.
Right.
I mean, in the metrics of him, perhaps that he is as happy as he can. Although, he talks about he feel like he could have the 7th championship and he regrets that they didn't go for the 7th championship. So
Right.
there's like never an end for him.
Right.
And you look at how he interacts with people and you listen to how other people talk about interacting with him, and they talk about how really the only times he showed emotion was that instance when they won the championship. And you see him, the way that he says hello to people and greets people is talking about competition and how he beat them or how he's going to beat them.
Right.
And so that doesn't strike me as particularly happy, but that is his perspective. It definitely doesn't strike me as something that you're giving positive energy to people, but I could be wrong, and everybody he's interacting with somehow seems to like that exchange because they're getting value out of him.
It could be perfectly fine for everyone else.
Seems unlikely, but okay. What he doesn't have a right to do, and what society needs to hold accountable to these figures, and also like not just like not in a mean way, just like also in an empathetic way, is to make sure that these types of behaviors don't have residual outcomes that are devastating. And we are a consumer culture so much further because of Michael Jordan and because of all the interests that surrounded him that offered him opportunities like as a business person. He maintained this facade of compartmentalization, look inoffensive, look cool for us, and we will provide you with money and influence and power. And not only it's not just the Nikes and the Haineses and the Gatorades. It is all the companies that saw that too and said, okay, let's use this model.
Right.
And we went along with it because we were in a very peaceful time, and we were witnessing something that was falling together in such a way that it felt correct.
Yeah, and we loved our capitalist society, and we didn't know about the harmful effects of using other people in the globe to fuel our capitalist society, and we didn't know what the sort of down the line steamroll of that was going to look like. Or maybe we did. I mean, I was like 4, 8 by the end of it. I didn't know. Maybe the adults knew and they just weren't sharing that information. But we certainly know now, and even young kids know now about the effects of these things. So
Yeah.
it's definitely time to switch it up.
Yeah. So I think that's probably enough.
Yeah, I think that's our review of The Last Dance.
Yeah. Definitely worth seeing, but probably not. Well, definitely worth seeing for the reasons that we mentioned, but maybe you'll have a different perspective on it.
I think a lot of people have different perspectives too. I mean, there's just one more thing that I want to say.
Yeah.
I think I'm even having a hard time criticizing Michael Jordan in any way because he is held up as a hero, and I do respect aspects of this, and it's so drilled into me to respect aspects of his what he's done and what his experience or what my experience of him was.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be a one or the other. I'm not vilifying him at all by making these critiques. And I think that that's also something that we have a hard time doing in both interpersonal relationships and when we're deciding what we want in different issues. We tend to say it's either good or bad, right? And we have a really hard time with this constructive critique. But I think that that's something that we all should be working on as well, both giving and taking constructive critique.
Yeah, I mean, he says it in the documentary, if you don't want to follow me, go follow somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's framing it in the context that he is a leader.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think I feel empathy for him insofar as this is not a rounded human being. I just don't think that we need to continue to have a society where greatness is contingent upon brokenness.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important we call it out.